Your story matters. It doesn't matter whether you're going for a job or you're selling yourself as a consultant. The stories you have about yourself create relevance, uh, connect with people, and often convey your value to the marketplace without being too salesy. I'm Justin Hitt with Inside Strategic Relations. I'm going to talk about the power of story and how I use story to help my clients increase their credibility, to gain influence in marketplaces, and ultimately be the person that gets selected when it comes for hiring. Now, you can use these stories in a job context. You can use these stories as an independent contractor or consultant. You can use these stories as a leader of an organization. But the key power of stories is that they convey contextual information in a hearable way. Now, this is very important. We all know the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. We know the story of Hercules. We know the story of certain, like the Trojan War, for example. Stories create a mnemonic, like a memory device that helps people remember things that are important to them. So the stories we write about ourselves are stories that connect a decision maker with the decision of hiring you over anybody else. Now, we're not talking specifically connecting the decision maker with you as an individual, because you as an individual, they don't give a damn about that. They don't care about who you are until they understand the value you can deliver to them. So again, we can use the story to connect that person's problems, pains, suffering, worries, constraints to the solution of hiring you, because you have the relevant context to solve their problem. So if there was a Venn diagram, you have the person who's going to read the story on one circle, and then you in another circle. Your story talks about the overlap and the connections. So I'm going to give you an example of a couple stories you can use. If I haven't said it already, I'm Justin Hitt with Inside Strategic Relations. The first type of story you want to make sure you have is your origin story. Now, you're going to have different stories for different contexts. So the example I'm going to give you here is that you're a free agent. Okay, because that's what I encourage you to be, whether you're working for a corporation, you're working for yourself, or you're working inside of a small business. You make decisions about your life. So your stories are going to represent you as someone who has value to a specific client. And so if you're working as an employee, that's a hiring manager or a recruiter. If you're working for yourself as a consultant, it's going to be your specific clients. And then of course, if you're working in a small business, it's going to be your customers. Again, the origin story. The origin story explains how you came to be. Now, again, a powerful story doesn't write about you as much as it writes about how your service or your value in the marketplace came to be. So we all know the story of Walt Disney. Walt Disney had a dream about having a park where families could get together, and everybody poo-pooed on his dream, and then he started to buy up land secretly, and then he had drawings of his dream, and he was a cartoonist. So the whole thing about how did he get started. So Walt Disney was a cartoonist before he was had Walt Disney World and all these different locations. Walt Disney got criticized, and then before he became famous. So we're writing the story that meets where our clients or customers are and takes them to where they're going in the context of your experience, and it is a reason why they should come with you versus somebody else. So the Walt Disney origin story is a regular guy who draws cartoons, and everybody says the cartoons are no good and nobody's going to want, you're not going to make a living doing this, and he showed them differently. So it's the headline. When I sat down at the piano, eh, uh, they laughed when I sat down at the piano until I started to play. So they laughed when Walt Disney was drawing cartoons and talking about this theme park until he created the theme park. Now the reader of that story sees in themselves overcoming something and now experiencing the dream. Now they vicariously experience Walt Disney's dream by attending the park, but that satisfies a need in the individual. And there's other stories. So that same story could work for a magician. A magician was interested in magic, and their family would laugh at him and say, "You'd never make a living being a magician," but now they're a famous magician. So again, it's your origin story. From whence did you come? Where did you come from, and what were the experiences that got you to where you are today, and why is that relevant to your audience? So, as an example, um, let's say you lived in a city and your customers live in a city. By the way, where you start is always where your customers are starting, and you wanted more outdoor adventures. So you're running a an outrigger company, and you wanted more outdoor adventures and excitement, but because you lived in a city, you were constantly surrounded by noise, and you decided one day to go on a camping trip, and you weren't really sure that you liked it, but when you got out there and experienced the freedom and the open, fresh air, and it just got into your heart, and now that's why you offer the outrigger services. Okay, so it's going to be your origin story. Another story you're going to share is your story overcoming obstacles. Now, what's great about this, and when I sit with a client to go over it, we actually build an inventory of all their achievements. Okay. We build an inventory of all the problems that they've overcome. And this is actually very lifting to the client because the client has never really thought about this. They're usually thinking about the problem they have today. They haven't thought about how they got to where they are right now. So many of my clients are very successful in what they do, but they come to me because they have like this immediate problem. And sometimes better communicating who they are and the value they deliver, they're doing it directly. They're showing them a better looking resume. They're almost boasting about the achievements that they have. But when we take these achievements and we put them into story format, it's now a more conversational tone, and it's something you can slip in a presentation. So overcoming an obstacle is a key here. Were you once poor and now you're rich? Are you the first person to ever go to college and now you've gone to college? What we do with the obstacle story is we talk about the big problems you faced and then overcame, and this sets up the qualifications that you can help a client do the same. So one of the things that I did in an environment is they had a RCSA initiative, which is a risk and control self-assessment, and it was in shambles. And so I was on one of the teams that built out the new framework for approaching RCSA, and we addressed 4 or 5 different issues, and we built out the framework. And then I went out and implemented it for my division. So we all went off and implemented it. And then my implementation was the most successful, the most consistent, and ultimately delivered the numbers on time, but it took working with a team. So some of the obstacles were the business units didn't want to follow the instructions. Some of the obstacles were outside executive pressure that was taking us off track of what we decided was the right approach to address the risks in this environment, and so on and so on. So I could show the mess that we were in beginning, the journey in the framework of obstacles, overcoming obstacles. This is different than an origin story because it's not sharing where I came from, it's sharing where we came from and what obstacles we overcome. And then finally, I can give 4 or 5 tips on how the audience can now overcome their own problems, can address fears, frustrations, and worries. So now there's a bunch of different story formats that we can go into. I think it's more instructive if we talk stories in general and how to apply these stories in persuasive communications, in biographical information such as your LinkedIn profile, and ultimately materials that represent you as a credible expert. So you may know I've completed a book recently called Establish Instant Credibility or Establishing Instant Credibility. I think it's available on leanpub.com, but definitely through my websites. One of the keys that I talk about in that book is creating an artifact that demonstrates your value to a client. Now, sometimes telling stories is difficult because we have a concept that nobody wants to know your story. And you're entirely right about that. Nobody really gives a damn about your story. What they care about, again, is the context of your experiences in the value of what they need as a business. So a hiring manager wants to know how you're going to help them solve specific problems. So when we write a story, we don't write the story from our own personal perspective. Yes, we're going to write an inventory of the stories that you repeatedly tell, the illustrative stories that you have told more than once. Maybe you onboard somebody and you tell them the story about how, the business really doesn't want to do this, but we have 5 reasons why the business should do it. And here's how I've approached it in the past. You're just going to write that down. You're also going to inventory your achievements. You're going to inventory your obstacles, and you're going to inventory your context. So you're going to take your resume and digest it into some kind of context for a specific audience. Then you're going to go into that specific audience and you're going to transform what you've experienced into what they need to get to the next level. So, a lot of times today, we're using, instead of getting to speak one on one, we're using media. Uh, Video conference calls, we're using presentations, we're using our resumes, we're using our LinkedIn profiles, we're using the content we post on different platforms. These stories are what's going to feed these platforms. So every story starts with lists of like elements, the achievements, the obstacles, and such, but then they get turned into a beginning, middle, and end. Now you could write an entire hero's journey, but to get somebody to sit down and listen to your epic journey to get where you are, you better be a senior level executive. Because there are times we're going to write the epic story. We're going to write the unauthorized biography and then put it out in the marketplace so that people will buy it and they'll be like, "Oh my gosh, this executive is, you know, these scandalous things that this executive has done." Those scandalous things were hand chosen to set context of why this is a maverick in the marketplace. So, whatever persona you want to present, you can use these stories to present that persona, but the stories have to be relevant to your audience. So, if you're writing stories for shareholders, these are going to be short quips that you use inside of a presentation, and they may not even be your story. They may be the story of the client that had a certain success, and that's why they should continue to invest in your organization. It could be the story of the problem the company has overcome and the key players in that. So, again, when we're writing these stories, we start with the reader. It is very compelling to tell your story about how you failed in business and now you've overcome the failure and you discovered the 15 strategies that are necessary for success in business, and you're successful now and they could be successful too if they work with you. That it's going to feel good for you to write that story, but again, the audience isn't going to be all that interested in listening to that story because it's about you. So we start with the reader, and we have to understand what obstacles they face and what challenges they face, and then we go back to our inventory and we match. So let's say you're a financial consultant and you help clients have a better lifestyle in retirement than they could afford in their working life. And the way that you do that is by 5 simple steps. Okay? They're not simple steps to do them on your own, but they're simple when you work with you because you have expertise in such and such. So you're going to talk about the clients who did not have a better lifestyle and the statistics about uh, different folks, not necessarily your clients not having a better lifestyle, but people who could have been your clients but didn't, chose not to, what horrible things happened to them. But also the general statistics that the majority of Americans do not retire with a lifestyle anywhere near what they were doing in their regular life. And very often they might have eaten steak and been the senior executive of an organization, but in retirement they're eating cat food and they could barely get out of their house that they had to downsize 3 times to get into. So you're going to find that overlapping match. The story is going to talk about the fears and the concerns, and then periodically come in and say, and that's why we worked with client X to do step one, step two, step three. And that's why we've developed these 5 steps, because living in poverty as a retiree after having 6 figures all your life is shameful but avoidable following these 1, 2, 3 steps. So we're almost taking the story and building the what's in it for them to frame the story and speaking with a specific audience, and then we're just barely putting our own stuff in there. Now the reason we want to talk about our story, because I know a lot of folks are hesitant about that, is because everything that's in this world, we don't need another pizza shop, we don't need another insurance agency, we don't need another financial planner. Everything is commoditized today. If you can't work with somebody in your own town, you can work with somebody in 5 towns over. The reason we inject our story is because that's what makes it unique. Your origin story is only your story. Nobody else can have an origin story like yours, because ultimately you were poor and now you're rich. That's the general framework, but the specific experience and story is what makes you the uniquely suited to serve a particular audience. But again, if you let your ego write the story, nobody's going to listen to it. Nobody gives a damn. You have to really use the egos of your potential clients. That's why we talk about target marketing. You have to write the story in a hearable way, and that's why you inject little tips and tricks or mistakes to avoid. And ultimately, that person who listens to the story feels connected with you, not because you're similar to them, but because you've overcome obstacles that they want to overcome. So you started where they are today and got to where they want to be in the future, and you can take them along this path. So the last thing I want to leave you with is the value of having a story inventory. So as you may know, I do copywriting and branding and different things for high income professionals, and I help their organizations increase sales and profits. I help you connect with people in the marketplace, and very often your story is going to help with that connection. Well, if you inventory these stories in one place, you can cultivate and develop these stories, because I do know at least half the people who have listened to this, maybe you haven't been with me for a while, but you're saying, well, my stories are not that interesting. Well, they might not be that interesting right now, but again, if you inventory the big obstacles that you've overcome and how did you overcome them, if you inventory where you were, early in your career versus where you are now, you can start seeing how these stories mirror the desires of your audience, and you can start cultivating these stories. Every public speaker has a story, and they have certain types of stories. And by the way, if we have more time, we can you can get you a bigger inventory of stories. But these stories and experiences, you almost want to write your own biography and build out this inventory, because there's times that you're using the same story over and over. What if that story was more powerful? When someone asks you in a job interview, tell me about a challenge that you faced and how did you overcome it? You'll actually have that story already written down somewhere, and you'll be able to just give them the story in a meaningful way. You'll understand that you need to say it in the context of their desires. You'll know what key ideas were necessary in the particular story, and then over time you'll drop out some ideas. I even have an inventory myself of hundreds of obstacles, hundreds of achievements, and then there's a narrative for each one of those, and it's usually just the paragraph, but it allows me to uh, impromptu provide the reason why I'm the right choice over someone else. Now, if you've gotten a copy of any of my books, you'll see my biographies in there. And sometimes the biographies work well, and sometimes they work poorly. So you're going to get this kind of in the context of interacting with an audience. But again, start with your origin story, as if you were going to sit down with your child and share your story. And then you take that story in writing and you go through the exercise that I described here, where we're now looking at the audience needs, desires, and context, and then coming back to our story and rewriting it for a specific audience. You want to think about why you're using stories. Are you a senior level executive who's going to use a story to rally the troops around a new initiative, or to choose you versus leaving the company and choosing someone else during a tough time? The development of these stories is a factual thing. You're not going to make up anything in your story, but there are times where you may, I don't want to say exaggerate, but you may make it sound more interesting than you think it is. Because I'm going to leave you with this last thing. A lot of times I sit down with clients and I say, well, tell me your story. And they say, oh, my story's not that interesting. It's more. And I'm thinking, you hired me to come in here and help you be more influential, to make you more credible in your marketplace. And now you're telling me your story's boring? Well, that's what you're saying to your clients. That's what you're saying to prospective employers, that you're boring and there's no reason to hire you. Let's develop a story. So, again, your story inventory may not feel very good to you, but if you go through it using the exercise that we described today, we can at least make it interesting to a target audience. And by making it interesting to a target audience, it gives you a stepping point, it gives you humility, It helps the client see that you're a real person and that you deliver specific value built on a set of experiences that nobody else is ever going to have. And then it ultimately can be shaped to become marketing stories so that you can connect with specific audiences, build trust, build emotional connection, and build loyalty in those audiences. Folks, we could go on for days about stories. In fact, I have a workshop that we go through the 5 key documents that every professional must have in order to market themselves, to get top pay in any market, to gain leadership positions, to go from manager to director. And if you'd like to be a part of one of those workshops, then visit me at www.insidestrategicrelations.com. Go to the contact page and just ask about the branding workshop. Um, we also talk about how to use stories in building relationships, which is extremely important because people want to be connected to those who they can relate to and ultimately benefit from. So these stories can help you with that as well. But again, it's that story inventory you got to start with. And I hope I've shared enough today that you can at least get started. And if you'd like to sit down for a paid consultation and go over your obstacles list, your achievements list, your story inventory, and start building that audience context, I'd be more than happy to get you started there as well. I'm Justin Hitt with Inside Strategic Relations. Uh, by the way, if you're a member of Inside Strategic Relations, you can just schedule this consultation anytime. It's part of your membership. And if you have questions about that, go to the contact page and ask, and we'll get you the information. But we will sit down and at least come up with one compelling story that you really could use as an introduction to a presentation. You can use to really get the audience's attention in a persuasive presentation, or ultimately more clearly communicate the value you deliver to an organization. And the story is just, it's so powerful and so connecting that investing here has an infinite amount of return. Thanks for listening to today's podcast. Whatever channel you're on, be sure to like and subscribe. But it's always best to get on our free email newsletter. That way, we can talk one on one about your situation and help you get the results that you're looking for while you transform business relationships into profits.